Kia ora. This is Stephanie Webb.
And Jamie D'Angelo.
Contacting you from Austin, Texas. And dang, that's too bad because New Zealand is beautiful.
Yes.
The name of our report is Green Spaces, Black Communities, Environmentalism as a Tool of Displacement in Austin, because they have been.
Parks and green spaces are often seen as a net public good, but when you plan these natural spaces, it's not a neutral process. Park creation requires, repossession of land to convert into green space, or the preservation of existing green spaces through redirecting growth and development somewhere else.
Because even though Austin is known for being very environmentally conscious and a very fit city, and I know this because I'm a marathoner and a triathlete, it's also very segregated, as was pointed out by the Martin Prosperity Institute of Toronto in 2015. And Austin is what you get when you're like, I really want a healthy environment for kids to grow up and families to develop, but I'm not paying attention to the fact that there are people of color in it.
Yeah, it's kind of a great case study for how environmental activism without a racial justice component is going to just reproduce those inequalities.
Because that's what we know.
Yes. So our paper has 3 components. We will talk a little bit about the history of environmental qualities in Black versus white neighborhoods and how we got to this point. We will then talk about a report that we did for the Parks Department that examines whether or not formal green spaces, parks and recreational facilities run by the city are welcoming to people of color and whether they're accessible. And in our third section, we'll touch briefly on what the feral is in an urban environment, what access to the natural means, and how maybe we need to start redefining it to start addressing some of these inequalities and inadequacies in our previous approach.
Exactly.
So, historic background, environmental quality in Black versus white neighborhoods. In 1928, the city's master plan relocated all facilities for people of color to East Austin, and made it very difficult for people who lived in other parts of Austin, who lived in free towns in West and Central and South Austin, to get the services that they needed without relocating to East Austin.
The 1928 master plan couldn't have happened without federal guidance. This was absolutely sanctioned by the nation, not just Austin. The Standard State Zoning Enabling Act and the Standard City Planning Act were federal laws that allowed cities to basically create the segregation that they wanted. It wasn't just some nefarious Austin idea, it was a national idea.
So on the public side, segregation was promoted. In the 30s and 40s, on the private side, many new subdivisions in Austin, such as Hyde Park, had racial covenants restricting who could live there.
And it also indicates why when you talk to a lot of urban planners and you talk to a lot of transit planners, they're very anti-subdivision.
Yes. So this combination of factors has led to concentration of people of color in East Austin. And once that was achieved, as Richard Rothstein pointed out in his book, The Color of Law, those environments started to degrade because the city no longer felt compelled to take care of them because people of color were not their first priority. A good example of this, and perhaps the most important, is that in the 50s and the 60s, industrial uses started to locate in East Austin. This was not actually permitted because residential uses are not supposed to be located near industrial ones, but the city didn't protect these neighborhoods, and so air quality, water quality, the quality of the neighborhood just really started to go downhill.
And it's really interesting because Black and Latino people get perceived as not wanting to exercise and go outside and play. Well, it's really hard when you've got a water treatment plant or a power plant right next to you, as we did,
yes,
which was the Holly Power Plant.
Yeah, and groups like Poder were really active in East Austin neighborhoods in holding the city accountable for this in the 80s and 90s, but still, that's affected the permanent quality of that area. So just to give an example of this persistence of environmental degradation and inequality, if you look at maps, for example, point source polluters as identified by the EPA, in 2000 and in 2014, they still pretty much correlate with environments that are where people of color live. There were 23 point source polluters in 2000. They switch up a little bit in 2014, but they're still roughly located where people of color are.
Exactly.
As another example and a final example of inequality between East and West, we want to briefly discuss water quality debates in the 1990s and the creation of desired development zones. Between 1980 and 1992, environmental groups in Austin were pushing for stronger water quality laws and protection zones and limits on development. And they ended up being really successful, particularly the Save Our Springs group, which wrote and had passed its own water quality ordinance in 1992, which essentially created a drinking water protection zone that ran up and down all of West Austin and left, or rather identified, East Austin as the desired development zone.
Wait a minute, Jamie. Do people in East Austin need to drink water? And is potable drinking water a problem in East Austin?
Apparently not.
So one thing that is missing from the conversation about Save Our Springs is the fact that it happened very quickly. Basically, the organization began in January 1992, and together they were able to push a Save Our Spring ordinance within 4 or 5 months by May 1992. That is a lot of autonomy given to a group of people with no experience in planning and with no dog in the fight as far as actually being residents in East Austin. So basically they said, hey, all you developers who want to create higher costs of living complexes, you can put it over in East Austin. So East Austin got all these expensive new apartment complexes, and it got all these parking lots, and it got all these businesses, and of course the property value for the long-term homeowners went way up, and people were unable to afford their homes because these high property values meant, hey, greater taxes.
And so just to quickly quote Robin Rather, who was very instrumental in the Save Our Springs group, who is now has different feelings about the role that her environmental activism played in the Austin landscape. Quote, I apologize. It sounds naive now, but we created something called the Desired Development Zone that would go east, and we would buy up and protect lands that were west. We wanted to conserve and protect the aquifer. I blame myself and all environmentalists at the time. We didn't understand they were talking about gentrifying neighborhoods and displacing people.
Well, and really, it's one of the reasons why the environmental quote-unquote movement is really controversial, because if you're not going to actually discuss the environmentalism and marginalization, you're not being honest.
Yeah, and because Austin's environmentalism is not dealing with race-based spatial inequalities, it reproduces them and it also deepens them.
Well, and really, it shows up extremely frequently in how Black and Latino people move.
Yeah.
Now, Jamie and I do not have cars, and not having a car in the city of Austin is extremely burdensome, and it means that you can't do so many different things that you want to do quickly. For example, I am a marathoner and a triathlete, and one of the biggest problems that I had when training for triathlons in East Austin was getting to a pool.
So our third section is based on an analysis that we did essentially pro bono for the Parks Department recently that looks at formal green spaces, parks and recreational facilities maintained by the city of Austin, and how inviting they are or accessible they are to people of color.
Because, you know, it's funny. In the beginning of the report, I talk about pools, and no, this is not just going back to training, but I talk about pools because the St. John's pool, which is located in East Austin, was decommissioned in the last 5 years, whereas pools that are just wading parks, and by wading parks, they are really only for toddlers. They're not to do any extensive swimming, and pools that will help you train for having swim teams and for amateur races were built up in West Austin. And one of the things that we noticed was that a lot of the groups in West Austin, which has a lot of the professional population, which has a lot of the businesses that actually allow for people to earn income develop advocacy groups. Because, friends of our blah, 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 save our blah, 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 that is a real issue, because whatever Parks and Recreation doesn't cover for West Austin, they talk to their advocacy group. Well, people in East Austin, we're generally working class, we're generally working poor, so we can make sure that the pocket parks are nice. And if you go around a lot of the pocket parks in East Austin, they look great, but we don't have pool money. We don't have paint the pool and keep the water fresh. And it's really interesting that I got to swim at Mabel Davis this summer. Mabel Davis is a 50-meter pool, which means it's an Olympic size, and it is in East Austin, because they finally fixed the leaking problem. And in West Austin, they didn't have to wait for things like that.
So really, it's an issue of spending and budgets, right? Wealthy neighborhoods and advocacy groups in wealthy neighborhoods, they can generate a lot of resources for their own parks to make up for a gap in quality of services. And that's just something that doesn't happen in parks in low-income areas.
And the biggest problem that you have in developing parks in the city of Austin is people's perception of who belongs at the park. Mm-hmm. Because, you see a lot of pictures of people in parks, and it's usually a lot of white people running, and a lot of white people with their families.
The optics are pretty questionable.
Oh my gosh. And then you see groups of Latino people or Black people at the park because, hey, we're supposed to be there, and it's, oh my gosh, it's crime laden. Oh my gosh, that park is degraded. Mm-hmm. And what's ironic is that the parks were supposed to be built as a place of public access.
Yes.
And so the city hasn't really dealt with the fact that there are even parks east. They don't mention parks east on their website.
Yeah, they really heavily promote Barton Springs as kind of the crown jewel in their park system. And they really minimize the amount of attention or energy that they give to not only budgets, but also programming and visibility for parks in East Austin. And so it's very uneven.
Well, and getting to Barton Springs is a nightmare.
Yeah.
There is one bus that goes there. Yes, there are bike lanes, but the problem is when you have a lot of people driving to the park, and we do, it is very unsafe to ride a bike because there's such a rampant car culture because this is Texas.
Yeah.
So, and because we cut down all the trees for development and to make it pretty, it's also very hot. And I know that people are aware of climate change, especially at this conference. So you've got a lot of no shade, and dangerous cycling. Mm-hmm. So it's not really safe to access the quote-unquote crown jewel.
Yeah, so the last component of this report is, how do people get to parks? Like, let's say a person in East Austin does want to use a West Austin park, because it's a public park. How is it accessible for them to get there? We're already starting off in a bad place because no, it's not in their neighborhood, but can they walk or cycle to a park? Can they use public transit? What's possible for them? And so we did our own analysis of park coverage. The park system will often analyze coverage in terms of a ratio method, just acres per person by region, and that's really inadequate.
Because think about it, cemeteries count as parks.
Yeah.
And golf courses count as parks. I mean, I don't know about you, but I would feel really uncomfortable whipping out a kickball
at the cemetery. Yeah, it's not really fine-grained enough in terms of its analysis. And Parks has been really not able to or unwilling to see how a lack of connectivity is affecting park access, right? Like East Austin doesn't have the same number of sidewalk miles, bus service, roads that are of high quality, right? All these things mean it's harder to get to parks.
Well, and there are a lot of parks. There are a lot of pocket parks. Mm-hmm. There's actually a state park in East Austin.
Yeah.
But because they're not shaded, because there won't necessarily be a water fountain, because they might be in somewhat disrepair, it just makes it a more difficult experience. And so even though people of color might want to go outside, well, we don't want to get caught up in, exhaust fumes just getting there. We might have to go to the bathroom while we're there, and we're not going to go to a place where we can't go to the bathroom.
Have to be responsible for the whole experience. Getting there, being there, feeling safe there, getting home.
Exactly.
So when we were talking about, people of color in park spaces, public spaces, there's an artist named Alicia Wormsley whose work I really like, and I included in our slideshow, and it's a billboard that says, quote, "There are Black people in the future." And it's just surprising how little attention is given to that notion.
Well, and it's just like, I don't know what to tell you. I know that we have formed this country based on a predominantly white image, but we're gonna have to do better.
Yeah, and the receipts are everywhere. And we often joke that we should go spray paint a bunch of signs, stick them in the middle of the park, and leave them there and say, Black people are allowed to be in this space. If you're acting weird because you see a Black person, remember that this is public space and you're not allowed to have a problem with that.
Well, and, it's like there's value given to being in the parks. There's value given to being in the wild, but there's value given in how you experience the wild, because everybody is like, oh, mountain climbers, oh, rock climbers, oh, hikers, you hike the John Muir Trail. And there's also an assignation of personal worth given to how many times you access things in the wild and how you do it. Yeah. Because again, people have picnics in the park all the time. You go by all those pocket parks and you see people having birthdays and you see people having parties, but you don't see them training for the Olympics. And so it's like, well, you just don't know how to play outside, so that's why we should take your parks away. It's like, no.
That's a perfect segue to our last section. So essentially, these models for creating green space that is available for all members of the public, regardless of race or class, it hasn't been particularly successful. So can we redefine what nature is in an urban environment? Can we redefine the feral to promote racial equity? Because as Stephanie pointed out, the perception and the association of people of color with degraded environments, it persists in our culture, right? Reversing that image is really important.
Well, and to stop basically seeing land as something that you use because you like it. It's like, no, the land has already existed.
Yeah.
People have to coexist with the land.
Yeah.
You don't get to basically say, well, these people don't get to coexist with the land, only we do. It's like, no, we're here too.
And if we are going to say that people need access to clean environments, they need access to recreational spaces, they need access to nature, our redefinition becomes important. So this sanitized notion of what green space is, what parks are, what formal green spaces are, it's not going to work, and we need to break it up a little bit, and we need to get at new environments and new possibilities.
Oh, and it helps us get rid of the lawn so that we can actually grow food in town again.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Can we want pop-up parks. We want urban ag. We want farmers markets and underutilized parking lots. We want people to have their own gardens. We want people to have their own livestock. We want people to be able to claim their backyards as a feral space.
And that's how we see the future, because we like to play outside.
Yes, outside is good.
So thanks for listening to our presentation, and hey conera.
Hey conera.